Hello hockey fans and welcome back to another video. During its 105-year lifespan, the National Hockey League has experienced its fair share of labour disputes. After all, whether it's their collective bargaining agreement being renegotiated pretty much every few years now, the half-season lockouts of 1994 and 2012, or the full-season lockout of 2004, both the NHL and the NHL Players Association don't always see eye to eye. Now, while most of these disputes are fairly recent, and while the two parties can negotiate for quite some time, it may surprise you to learn that the NHL's first labour dispute took place all the way back in 1925, when an entire roster of players refused to finish their season until their various demands were met. So how did this protest work out? Would the players get what they wanted, or would the league punish them for their actions? Well, let's dive back into the history books and try to find out, shall we? So in today's video, join me as we explore the first players' strike in NHL history. Now, in order to understand how and why this strike took place, we must first learn about the team that caused it, so allow me to introduce you to the Hamilton Tigers. Originally known as the Quebec Bulldogs, the Tigers would move to Hamilton in 1920 and receive their new nickname after the NHL sold the Bulldogs to the Abso Pure Ice Company of Hamilton, Ontario. Though the Bulldogs had produced their fair share of success while in Quebec, and they had won several Stanley Cup championships during their lifespan, the Tigers wouldn't live up to these lofty expectations. In fact, Hamilton would play so badly after their relocation that they finished dead last in the NHL standings during each of their first 4 seasons, where they registered a 28-68-0 record in 96 regular season games during that span. However, the 1924-25 NHL season saw Hamilton's fortunes seemingly change overnight, with their roster featuring several future Hall of Famers and being described as, quote, a magnificent hockey machine by Ottawa Senators manager Tommy Gorman. Hamilton finished first place in the league standings with a 19-10-1 record in 30 games, thanks in large part to the high-scoring play of Red Green, Billy Birch and Shorty Green, the strong goaltending of Jake Forbes, as well as the impressive tactics from the Tigers' new head coach Jimmy Gardner. Though they had produced their best season since relocating from Quebec, and they looked poised to compete for the Stanley Cup, thanks to the events of the following weeks, things would take quite the unexpected turn. After playing their final game of the season on March 9th, 1925, the Tigers boarded a train from Montreal to Hamilton and headed back home. During this journey, many Tigers players began airing their grievances surrounding their pay, or lack thereof, towards the end of the season. These frustrations culminated in team captain Wilfred Shorty Green approaching Tigers general manager Percy Thompson and demanding that each player receive $200 for their final 6 games that year, with the team threatening to boycott the playoffs should their demands not be met. Now, it's worth mentioning that the NHL had increased its schedule from 24 games up to 30 games for the 1924-25 season, but since their player contract stated that they would receive the same amount of money for the entire year no matter how many games were played, the Tigers roster wouldn't receive any extra pay despite playing half a dozen more contests than the year prior. You can see why the players weren't too happy with this arrangement, can't you? Upon hearing their requests, Percy Thompson reminded his captain of how their player contracts were structured, claimed that the team didn't have enough money to give them what they wanted, and even said that he couldn't pay them during the playoffs if he wanted to. However, the Ottawa Citizen disputed these claims, as they reported that the Tigers made an extra $25,000 in profits as a result of their strong season that year, so the team had more than enough to pay each player the $200 that they were asking for, as well as compensate them during the postseason too. However, when Thompson refused the demands of his players and his roster prepared to boycott the playoffs, the Tigers GM immediately informed the NHL's head office and asked them to resolve the situation instead. And thus began the first players' strike in NHL history. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I completely agree with the players' decision to go on strike here. Sure, their contracts clearly stated that they would earn a fixed salary each season, but those deals were agreed upon when the regular season schedule only included 24 games. If the NHL wanted them to play 6 more contests, they needed to pay them in order to do so. And besides, the Tigers had plenty of money to cover these costs. It's not as if Hamilton couldn't give their players what they wanted and still walk away with a pretty hefty profit too. Now, while I understand that the league is a business above all else, and while I can certainly understand that the NHL didn't want to concede to the players here, as they didn't want other teams' rosters getting the same idea, $200 a player really isn't too much to ask, is it? After all, the league itself chose to add half a dozen games to the schedule. They shouldn't be surprised when their player base wants to be fairly compensated for their services. I mean, what did they think was going to happen? The players would thank them for the extra work and beg them to do it for free? They're professional hockey players, for goodness sake. You have to pay them for their talents. Imagine if every fan in the stands was given a free ticket to all 6 of these games, and all the concessions that they bought were on the house. The owners would be pretty upset with this arrangement, wouldn't they? They'd probably try to cancel all of these games, as they would end up losing a lot of money from them, right? So why is it okay when the owners do it to the players? Just because your roster is expendable doesn't mean that it isn't valuable. So just give them the $200, Thompson. It really isn't that hard, you know? But how did this story end? Did the players get their wishes, or did the league come out on top? Well, having been informed of the situation, NHL President Frank Calder warned the Tigers roster that they could all be fined or suspended indefinitely if they chose to boycott the playoffs. Not only that, Calder supposedly ordered Percy Thompson to hold any back pay that was owed to the Tigers players, in the hopes of making them think twice about their decision and stopping the strike before it even began. Since he was known for putting the owners' finances above everything else, I imagine that Frank Calder enjoyed putting the squeeze on the players whenever he got the chance, and if this entire situation doesn't prove that, I don't know what will. Despite the lack of compensation from their owners and the immense pressure from the league, the Tigers players wouldn't give in, as they supposedly claimed that they would rather retire than allow themselves to be taken advantage of, and they remained on strike once the playoff semi-finals concluded on March 13th, 1925. Interestingly, it is also said that Tigers captain Shorty Green met with Frank Calder that very same day to try and reach an agreement between the two sides, but the strike would ultimately continue once both men departed without a deal being finalised. With the Montreal Canadiens advancing to the finals, and with the Hamilton Tigers roster still refusing to play, Calder decided that enough was enough. Less than 24 hours later, on March 14th, Calder declared that Hamilton had been disqualified from the playoffs, and that the Montreal Canadiens had been crowned post-season champions by default. Not only that, Calder also announced that the entire Tigers lineup was suspended from the league, and that each player had been fined $200. So not only were their demands left unmet, and they lost their chance to bring Hamilton its first Stanley Cup championship, each Tigers player had been suspended from the league, and they were each fined the same amount of money that they had asked for during their strike. Calder knew exactly what he was doing with that punishment, didn't he? Unfortunately for both the players and their fanbase, this strike would signal the beginning of the end for the Hamilton Tigers. Shortly after their exit from the playoffs, the Tigers roster released a statement thanking their fans for their support, while also expressing their severe disappointment over the lack of assistance from the executive side of the club. In fact, the players were so upset with Hamilton's ownership that the entire roster refused to play another game for the Tigers while Percy Thompson owned the team. Talk about a mutiny, eh, folks? If all of that wasn't bad enough though, it is also said that the NHL ordered Hamilton to build a new arena as punishment for their players' transgressions. But the Tigers estimated that it would cost them roughly $200,000, approximately $3 million today, in order to do so. Money that they simply didn't have to spend on such a project. So yeah, Hamilton had clearly seen better days. With the league demanding a new arena and with their players still on strike, the Tigers knew that they had reached the end of the line. In the summer of 1925, Percy Thompson sold the rights to the entire Tigers roster for $75,000 to New York Americans owner Big Bill Dwyer. Though a Hamilton franchise was still expected to compete in the upcoming 1925-26 NHL season, since they were still included in the league's preliminary schedule, the Tigers would withdraw from the league before the season began and ceased operations shortly after. Not exactly the greatest ending, but at least the team made NHL history, right? It's just a shame that it cost the franchise its entire existence in the process. Though the Tigers roster had been sold to New York, the players had a new owner and their strike had seemingly come to an end, NHL president Frank Calder wasn't about to let these players off the hook. According to some reports at the time, Calder supposedly told the players that their suspensions from the league would be lifted if they paid their $200 fine, and they wrote a letter to Calder himself apologising for their actions. Not only that, when Calder supposedly began to receive these letters, it is said that he made several players write another one as he didn't feel that they were sorry enough. That said, other sources claim that the players never sent Calder any letters whatsoever. So take this story with a pinch of salt, okay? Whether Lettergate was true or not, what has been confirmed is that none of the Tigers players ever received the $200 that they demanded during their strike, while both their $200 fine and their suspensions from the league were eventually dropped by the NHL. However, after the Tigers roster was sold to New York, it is said that Frank Calder ordered the Americans to hold back $300 of each player's salary as a good conduct bond. So it sounds like Calder got the last laugh in this situation, and he even made the league some extra money while he was at it too. You can see why the owners like this guy, can't you? Though they forfeited their shot at the Stanley Cup and their demands were never met, the players' strike of 1925 showed that the Hamilton Tigers roster were willing to put their NHL careers on the line to prove that they weren't going to be taken advantage of without a fight. Sure, the league would ultimately come out on top in this scenario, but this strike became the first step in a long road towards players earning their rightful share of league revenues. After all, an NHL franchise was forced to sell its entire roster and cease operations only weeks after this strike began. If that doesn't show you just how sizable of an impact this action had, I don't know what does. It may not have caused any real change at the time, and the Tigers didn't get the happy ending that they wanted, but these players can rest easy knowing that they have cemented their place in the NHL's history books. There's certainly worse ways to be remembered, that's for sure. And on that note, I'm going to end today's video. That was a look at the first players' strike in NHL history. What do you guys think about the Hamilton Tigers franchise or their 1925 players' strike? Do you agree that the players should have been compensated for their services, or do you think that the NHL was in the right all along? Let me know in the comments below, I would love to hear what you guys think. But thank you very much for watching, guys, I hope you have enjoyed. Please feel free to like, subscribe, share, or watch some of my other videos. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye. A big thank you to Clayton Hallam, Drew Fawcett, Houston NG, Lucas Gates, Raquel and Worthless Pieces for helping support this video via Patreon. If you too want to help support the channel a little bit further and get a shout out at the end of every future video, make sure you head over to patreon.com/oddmanrush and become a patron today.